There's a way to get second citizenship that, at least on the surface, is extremely affordable, and yet we never really talk about it that much. Today, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of citizenship by naturalization. So very simply, naturalization is the process of obtaining citizenship through being naturalized, by living in another country, basically becoming one of them. In some rather rare cases, it could take as little as 2 or 3 years. 5 years is a number that a lot of countries have, or 6, 10, 12, 20, 30. So anywhere between 3 and 30 years generally is the standard that you're looking at, as well as some processing time on top of that. And so there's not necessarily going to be a lot of costs associated with that, but there are some hidden quote-unquote costs that I want to share with you today, and whether being naturalized in another country is a good idea for you to consider. If it's your first time here, my name is Andrew Henderson. I'm the founder of Nomad Capitalist. We are a boutique consultancy that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally reduce their taxes, get second citizenships, basically go where you're treated best. I'm also the host of the biggest and best offshore conference called Nomad Capitalist Live, open to absolutely everyone. And so we often don't talk about this because if you are a 7- or 8-figure entrepreneur, there may be more cost-effective, time-effective, opportunity cost-effective solutions to getting a second citizenship. However, citizenship by naturalization is one of the most common ways to get citizenship. Let's say you live in the United States, where I'm originally from. You have no doubt seen those citizenship ceremonies. People get together in a big hall, or sometimes in a smaller hall, and they have their hands in the air, and they're reciting the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever it is they do, and they're waving American flags, and then they're given basically a citizenship certificate, and they become a U.S. citizen. Not because they were born there, not because their parents were from there, but because they moved from somewhere else. They had an immigrant visa, and they were able to start racking up time towards whatever the criteria was in whether it's the U.S. or any other country. And so that process takes a while. Now, in some countries where things aren't as developed, the process may be easier, maybe much more straightforward, may have fewer twists and turns. On the other hand, generally speaking, if you can get through all the hoops and hurdles of a country like the United States, I think they're generally going to honor their word in terms of, hey, here's what it takes to be naturalized. If you do that, we'll naturalize you. We may drag our feet using COVID as an excuse, or we may have lots of different documents to collect. The fees may be high for a lot of people, but hey, we're going to generally speaking deliver. I would say a number of Western European, Northern European countries do that. Australia, But you've seen people become naturalized. You can become naturalized in countries like Argentina. You can become naturalized in countries in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, right? It's harder in Asia, but there are emerging countries where you can go and put in the time, or you can go to Western countries. So let's walk through this. What is required? Generally speaking, you've got to move somewhere. You generally will need to learn the language, and then you can work your way towards citizenship. So the first part of the process is going to be the application time. So just like getting any other residence, how long does it take to go through whatever the procedures are, whether it's going through a background check. Obviously, that can be pretty strict in a number of higher passport, Tier A passport countries like the U.S., like Germany. There may be a longer background check. Not every residence permit necessarily leads to citizenship, by the way. In the U.S., there's what's called non-immigrant visas, like an E-2 visa that may not necessarily lead to citizenship. In a country like Ireland, for example, you've got things like Stamp 0, where that's not going to lead to citizenship, whereas like a Stamp 4 visa would. So some countries have different criteria, but you've got to go and say, okay, it might take 3, 6, 12, sometimes it could take years, but 3, 6, 12 months in many cases to get my residence permit. That time doesn't count towards citizenship. Then you get the permit, then you go. And you might start with temporary residence. Occasionally, you might jump right to permanent residence. You might go temporary and then permanent. There are some cases where you can go directly from temporary to applying for citizenship. You never have to apply for permanent. So permanent residence offers, depending on the country, a greater standard, or sometimes it just offers the benefit that it doesn't have to be renewed. So all these countries are entirely different. But let's just take the example of a standard country in Western Europe, 5-year residence period. You may have to be there for at least 6 months a year. You may have to be there for as much as 9 or 10 months a year. And so let's take an example of where the time cost comes in. Ireland, for example, you're going to spend pretty much like the vast majority of your time if you want to get naturalized in 5 years, because they have a days count. Canada has a days count. It's 3 out of 5 years. And so, the bigger the country, theoretically, the more opportunities you have if you want to be moving around, if you have the nomadic spirit, if you want to have, different bases, certainly, living in a country like the U.S. with all the different places you could go and spend time, it's almost like having different countries at your fingertips compared to like a country like an Ireland or a Belgium or something where you're kind of stuck there. Obviously, in the Schengen area, you can kind of move around a little bit, but may not be recommended in all cases. But you're going to be basically having a high lifestyle cost for a lot of the higher quality citizenships. Now, you go to some of the more emerging countries, people often ask about Argentina. It could take as little as 2 years plus the part at the beginning, the 2 years of waiting, and then the part which every country has where you actually, once you meet the criteria, you apply for citizenship. So Argentina is not really going to take 2 years because there's a front end and there's a back end in addition to the actual residence period. But people say, hey, does that work? Sure. You don't have to spend maybe quite as much time there as you would in a Western country, but it's largely civil law system, so it's going to be more guided by what does the judge say. And if you're going to spend less time there, then maybe you have to explain why. And so the rules are more flexible in some emerging countries, but that also can work against you depending on who you get throughout the process. So tax cost, lifestyle cost, opportunity cost. We talked about Ireland and the fact that you need to be there nonstop for almost 5 years. Other countries are going to be like that. Again, other countries maybe only require 6 months. And the fact that, hey, pretty much any country you're going to be naturalized, you have to live there. If you don't have to live there, that's what we call a paper residence, where you just get the residence permit and maybe you just check in once a year to renew it, and you've got a decent chance of getting citizenship in the future. We talked about those at Nomad Capitalist Live, for example. But understand, in most of these situations where you're being naturalized, you're going to have what's called tax residence. So you're going to be a resident for immigration purposes, but you're also eventually going to trigger tax residence, either because you pass a certain number of days there in order to keep your residence permit active and to keep qualifying citizenship, and or because it becomes your center of life, your center of social interest, what have you. And so depending on the country's tax system, there may or may not be exemptions, there may not be ways, your entire business, that's even if it's outside of the country, may be dragged into the tax net. So you may be taxed at very high rates. You look at a country, let's just take the aforementioned Germany and Ireland. If you have a decent income, you're going to be paying half of that income basically in taxes. And you're going to be paying the lifestyle cost of actually having to spend time there. And so if you want a top tier passport, but you don't really like the country, that's going to be a lifestyle cost. And then you're going to have the opportunity cost of all that money you're paying to the government to basically in taxes for a country that you don't want to live in. Now, if the idea is, hey, I love Germany and I'd love to be a proud German citizen, and you know what, I will spend 6 to 8 years plus, again, the time at the beginning and end, and I'll commit to being in Germany for a good part of that time, then you can make that determination. But if you're a 7 or 8 figure entrepreneur, it's going to cost you a decent amount of money. So here's my advice on who should consider this. If you're just starting out, if you can find a way, there are some countries where student visas or similar visas, you can actually use that time towards citizenship. If you can get your first job to learn, maybe you're starting a business. We always say if you're going to start a business and you think it's going to be successful, it's better to start somewhere that's tax friendly, because once you build up a big business over the course of 5 years waiting for citizenship, 5, 6, 7 years, it's going to be harder to move that business out. So you're going to have a cost to exit that tax system that you could have avoided had you lived in, let's say, Dubai or the Cayman Islands or Panama or what have you. Those countries either aren't going to offer you citizenship, or citizenship just probably isn't something that you're likely to be granted. So which is more important if you're just starting out? Would you pay some amount of tax? If I look back, knowing what I know now, I would say, sure, it would have been worth a couple of years of going somewhere, potentially to a country like an Ireland, like a Portugal, like in Italy, where you can live there, be tax resident, and you have some tax advantages, and they will still put you on the track to citizenship. If you're a foreigner, you can use those tax advantages. You may not be able to use them in some cases once you are a citizen. So once you're a citizen, now you're leaving the country. If you decide to warm up to it, that's another consideration. But if I'm already experienced, I want access to Europe, I might look at Malta's citizenship program. Sure, it's going to cost me, if I'm single, a little under $1 million. But let's run the numbers. You're making $1 million a year, and you've got to live in Germany. Let's call it 8 years. If you're paying 50% in tax, all told, that's $4 million, plus whatever the opportunity cost was every year of what you could have done to invest that money back into your business, back into other investments, what have you. Could that have turned into $5, $6, $10 million? Who knows? But that's the cost versus the $1 million. Now, what's the opportunity cost of the $1 million up front? You've also got to factor that in. But, I think that people look at naturalization as, oh, it's cheap. And the reality is, if you're already successful, you're going to pay with your time. you're going to pay with your money in the form of taxes. You're also going to pay for the more expensive lifestyle in many of these countries versus living in somewhere that's a bit more up and coming and affordable. And you're also going to pay just for the simple fact that you don't have as much control over your life. Is it worth that to get a passport? What I would also posit is that maybe you don't need the world's best passport. Now, if you want to live in Germany, or perhaps even if you want to live in Europe, I mean, that passport could be valuable. Any European Union passport could be valuable to live in Europe. But you can have a citizenship from, let's say, a Caribbean country. It's going to cost you $100,000 and change all in. And you can get a residence permit to go and live in Europe. You can get a golden visa that doesn't require you to live there, but allows you to actually spend as much time as you want. And you can figure out year by year how much time you're going to spend there, do your tax planning, move around a little bit. And so I think that the idea of stacking is a part of a holistic plan. Residences and citizenships that accomplish one unified goal saves you a lot of money in the long run. So you're going from, I want to be a European Union citizen, I'm going to spend $4 million over the next 8 years to get that citizenship, versus spending $100,000 and change now, maybe investing $250,000 or $300,000 in property, or going to Malta and making a donation for their residence program. Maybe I'm out the door $250,000 and I'm saving that in 6 months, and now I have a plan where I get to live where I want. I have a citizenship that protects me, and I'm covered. So there are some opportunities where it's a bit more palatable. Let's say that you're entitled to Spanish citizenship by descent. A lot of times there's a 1-year requirement there. There generally is a decent amount of processing time on the back end of those. Brazil, if you give birth or you get married to a Brazilian, or you adopt a Brazilian child, I mean, that's a year plus a little bit of processing time. Maybe they're a bit more flexible. But you might be in those countries' tax nets. Would I go into the Spanish tax net for a year to get European Union citizenship? Again, depends on my situation. If I'm going to pay $2 million in tax, it just doesn't work out unless I really feel a great pride in being Spanish. But then I've got to exit the tax system after that, and that's going to be perhaps more complicated. So these are the things that you want to keep in mind. But if the goal is Spanish citizenship for its Tier A qualities, Malta perhaps would do that just as well. So you have to kind of, those are ones where it's faster, maybe it's easier, but the higher up you go with income, the more difficult these naturalization ones are going to get, and the more that you're going to expect in terms of having a level of personal freedom that our clients demand that you're just not going to have when you're chained to a country for 6, 9, 10 months a year. That's why we often don't talk about citizenship by naturalization.